Among countless notable achievements in exploration, 5 firsts achieved by our members define the legacy of the Explorers Club. 1909, the North Pole. 1911, the South Pole. 1953, the highest point on Earth, summiting Mount Everest. 1960, the lowest point on Earth, the Marianas Trench. 1969, the surface of the Moon, the Apollo 11 mission. The club's founding mission, to promote exploration by all means possible, remains our driving force. Headquartered in New York City with a community of chapters around the world, the Explorers Club supports scientific expeditions of all disciplines and unites our members in the bonds of good fellowship. Historic flags are carried on our most distinguished expeditions. Our members are storytellers and changemakers. We are driven by the instinct to explore, forge new frontiers, and push boundaries for the scientific advancement of human knowledge. We are explorers. Together, Fjällräven and the Explorers Club inspire the world to walk with nature. Join us each month for a thought-provoking and exciting new episode featuring explorers from around the world as they share their work and stories from the field. Our goal is to push the boundaries of curiosity, explore the wild around us, and inspire new and seasoned explorers to discover nature in a new way. The sense of togetherness with nature has never been more crucial. This is the Explorers Club Fjällräven Speaker Series.
Hi everyone, I'm Dave Klinges, a Fjällräven Field Grant awardee and an interdisciplinary ecology PhD student here at the University of Florida in Gainesville, which is the traditional lands of the Seminole and Timucua peoples. My research explores the intersection of human land use with climate change, especially in the tropical rainforest of Madagascar, to understand if deforestation or warming temperatures pose greater threats to rainforest wildlife. Past that, I also work with Madascar National Parks to build a community member monitoring program of the biodiversity of the rainforest. And past my research, I'm always happy to get out hiking, kayaking, or diving.
Hi everyone, my name is Samantha Walker and I am a non-Indigenous scholar whose research focuses on the archaeology of ancient peoples from the Inuit homeland of Nunavut in Arctic Canada. I am the primary investigator of the Igloolik-Tuunit Archaeological Project, a project that would not be possible without the funding support I've received from institutions like Fjällräven and the Explorers Club. I am also the founder of the Walker Education and Research Foundation, a small charity dedicated towards educational programming in remote Canadian communities. Currently, I am also completing my PhD in anthropology at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. And I would like to mention that the city called Montreal is also known as Tiohtià:ke in the language of the Kanien'kehá:ka, and has been a place of residence and exchange among Iroquoian peoples and a meeting place for Algonquin and Inuit since time immemorial. I'm honored to be speaking with you today from these traditional lands, especially to discuss my research on human-land relationships in Northern Canada.
So Sam, starting off, how did you get involved with work up in Nunavut and your initial interest in archaeology and Arctic science? How did you get inspired into these areas?
Oh, thanks for asking. Well, actually, I got my start in archaeology all the way back in high school. Back then, I wasn't the best student, and part of that was just I wasn't interested in anything in particular. And I had one teacher who taught a world history course and an archaeology course, and through her, I got to volunteer, work with different educational programs, and excavate on local sites around the high school. And so then I decided to do that for my research, and I pursued archaeology in university for my undergraduate and my master's. And throughout that process, I more and more became interested in studying peoples that economically might be defined as hunter-gatherers, because I was very interested in this relationship of place and landscape to people that are highly mobile and move around a lot. I understood how I was attached to places, but I was wondering what those relationships might be like for people that are very mobile and have these different, in some ways, much more intimate relationships with nature. During my undergrad and my master's, I worked with different types of societies, varying from South Africa to the eastern woodlands of Canada. And then for my PhD, I had the opportunity to work in Nunavut because there was a project that really fit my research interests and that needed someone that had a specialization in landscape research. So I sort of fell into it, and it's just been the most amazing experience ever working up north. So Dave, thanks for chatting with me today. For my first question, I wanted to ask you also how you got your start in research, specifically ecological research, and especially what drove you to conservation studies in Madagascar specifically?
Yeah, I can't really remember a time that I wasn't fascinated by wildlife, especially in the tropics. It has always been this core part of my identity where I think for a lot of us, we got into research because of some fundamental passions we had, and we loved to get outside because of some experiences we had when we were younger. And for me, I just grew up loving the idea of going to see chameleons out in the wild. I had pet chameleons and pet poison dart frogs, but it didn't feel as if I was really giving back. And so I thought that going into a career of studying ecology was a way to help conserve these systems through understanding. So I've always been really set upon working in Madagascar because it's one of the most biodiverse regions in the world. It's this island that has all of these endemic species, species that are found nowhere else in the world. And I found that concept just so fascinating. There's so many different regions and different climates that are found there. And now that I've had the chance to go and conduct some fieldwork there and learn more about the species and the communities and the culture, it's really surpassed all of my dreams. I think in particular of the first time that I stepped foot in the rainforest in Montadilla National Park, and I heard one of the Indri lemur species calling, and it's this beautiful moaning wail. And I basically broke out crying because it was just really magical moment. So I haven't really looked back since. So Sam, both of us work in these fairly hard to access places, at least from where we're coming from. What are some of the logistics of getting out into the field for you?
For me, getting out into the field starts with commercial flights. So we usually go from here in Montreal through different hamlets, and we make our way north. Usually it's through the capital of Nunavut, which is Iqaluit, and then we make our way to the hamlet of Hall Beach and then to Iqaluit. And then that's usually where we get our resources together, and we wait for a prop plane to come and pick us up to fly us to a more remote location, or sometimes a local friend will take us on their fishing boat, depending on the weather and how far out we're going, and if the ocean's still frozen or if it started to thaw and that sort of thing. But for us, it usually involves commercial flights and then a private flight or a boat ride. And a lot of our work takes place in these very remote communities, or outside of these remote communities, in these no longer inhabited areas. A lot of them were inhabited as early or as recently as 50 years ago, but there were forced relocation programs. And so now there's these isolated little hamlets, and then these large regions around them are uninhabited. So because of that, logistically, it gets a little complicated for us. We have to make sure that all of our food, all of our safety supplies, our camping supplies, and our equipment, that we have everything for 4 to 8 weeks. And that's also one of the reasons why Arctic field seasons tend to be pretty short, and our field crew are usually limited to between 4 and 7 people because of that. So it's usually 4 to 8 weeks, 4 to 8 people, and
Wow.
just us living on the land. And
A lot you have to get done in a very short amount of time with a small group.
yeah, just some good old-fashioned camping experiences. So Dave, I would love to know more about the logistics for your field work also. How do you get out to these places, and what does a typical day look like for you once you're out there?
Yeah, I mean, we all love logistics, don't we? For me, it's also starting with a plane ride from here in the United States to the capital of Antananarivo in Madagascar. And then we're followed by about a 10-hour taxi bus drive, which is one of the public buses slash taxis, weather dependent, especially because we're working in the rainy season. The roads can sometimes not always be in the greatest condition. From there, we stay for a few nights at a research station called Centro Val Bio, which is situated near Ranamafana National Park. And some of my work is inside the national park, but I also take a day and a half backpacking trek to some villages around the national park. For instance, in the village of Ambalaveru, which has these gorgeous scenic sites of rock cliff faces situated with patches of forest and rice paddy and banana plantations. It's a very mixed landscape. And a typical day for us is we'll be out camping in one of the villages or in the areas that we're working with, living alongside some of the Malagasy researchers that have come from the capital with us, as well as some of the local guides and researchers that live in that village itself. And we have different questions that we're posing with our research, some of which is, for instance, looking at the climate tolerance of frogs that are found on the forest floor versus high up in the canopy. So on a typical day, in order to study some of the frogs that are found up in the canopy, we have to get up there. And we'll go out with these 10-foot slingshots out on the trails to find a tree that looks hopefully relatively safe to climb. And we'll take a lead weight that we put in the slingshot. We aim for a branch that's usually about 30 meters or so high. And we pull it back, and after maybe about 30 minutes of shooting and missing, we finally get it up there, which allows us to pull a climbing rope up to the top. And we'll spend the days then climbing up in order to deploy temperature loggers and relative humidity loggers that we'll put along the branches and inside holes in the trees and inside ferns to understand some of the microclimates that these frogs might be exposed to. And then we return at night and we climb some of the same trees, but this time with headlamps that allow us to basically see everything around us. And we'll climb up and be looking for frogs while hanging on these ropes so that we can capture them and identify the species and measure some of their body shapes and sizes and then release them back to the same tree. So it's a pretty exciting and packed day, but I really love getting out there.
Oh, that's wild. No pun intended. So you mentioned microclimates, and previously when we talked, we chatted a bit about scale in research. Would you mind explaining again what exactly a microclimate is and why they're so important to your research?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. Microclimate is definitely a big interest of mine. And for a lot of us in ecology, it's been a growing theme. So when a lot of us talk about climate change, for instance, we're trying to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming. That's an average across the whole planet that has been derived from weather stations that were put out in the open, nowhere near trees or buildings or any of these features of the landscape that can be pretty important for wildlife and for people. The reality is that when we interact with a place, we're not experiencing this open air conditions. We may be in the shade, inside or inside a forest or within a valley where it's nice and cool. So microclimate is the exploration of understanding the differences in temperature and relative humidity very close to the ground, as opposed to these open ambient conditions. For a frog species, for instance, a lot of them are nocturnal and only come out and are active at night, while during the day, they hide in holes inside trees or inside dead logs or underneath leaves. And underneath a leaf, the temperature might be up to 5 degrees Celsius cooler than it is above the leaf. That can be a tremendous difference and really important for the ecology of that frog. So by going out and measuring temperature in some of these places that the weather stations don't capture, we can better understand how phenomena such as climate change may be realized in these tropical rainforests. So scale is pretty important for our work in ecology, but from some of our conversations, Sam, it's pretty important for you as well, both spatial and temporal scales. So could you talk a little bit about what scales that you're exploring and what are some of the different drivers at different scales?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for asking that. So for me, I'm taking approaches that are more common in other areas of archaeology when it comes to scale, specifically what's called a landscape approach, which is sort of a deviation from this focus on the archaeological site and trying to understand the relations between sites, but also the relations between what we call sites and other aspects of landscape. So the areas that might be natural areas where there is no built space, there's no cultural modification, but things that were just necessarily important for people's survival and also that shape their experience and meaning of the landscape. So these can be things like fresh water sources, access to the coasts where animals tend to be that are hunted, access to different outcrops for toolstone, and also just the natural contours of the landscape that influence things like visibility. So a big part of my research is taking this landscape approach into Arctic research. And it's not something that's really been done before. And the main reason for that goes back to logistics. So in other parts of the world where you can drive to an archaeological site or where you can pay someone to fly over the site to collect aerial data, or where you have a charging station so you can charge the batteries for your drones, it's a lot easier to collect those kinds of data. And I've come across some hiccups and some challenges trying to employ some of these methodologies so that I can go about having a landscape-oriented approach in my research. So typically in the Arctic, we have these field seasons that are between 4 weeks and 8 weeks. The main reason for that is because the primary method is excavation, so digging up these ancient houses and trying to learn about the past that way. But this is very limited in terms of when we can do it each year because the Arctic is typically frozen and there's permafrost. So there's a very short period of time where the ground's actually thawed enough that we can dig. So that's one big issue. The other big issue is that these are enormous landscapes. And like I said before, there's very few hamlets in the area, and a lot of the places we are working are uninhabited places. So typically we rely on a small prop plane, a twin otter, or a boat to take us to site, and then we typically wait for them to pick us up. If we go by plane, we have access to one ATV for the crew, and we can use that to move around. But it's very difficult to move around the landscape. It's very difficult to transport our excavation equipment so we can actually do these excavations. So surveying and figuring out where archaeological features are and then actually digging them up has been a lot more difficult to do in the Arctic. So our data sets tend to be smaller, and this makes it a lot harder to understand things like settlement. So in terms of data collection for me, the data sets that we've worked with traditionally in Arctic archaeology have been very small compared to other parts of the world. So it's a lot harder to understand things like how people moved around the landscape, what their settlement practices were in the past, and what placemaking practices they participated in. And so that could be really problematic. So for me, I've integrated drone technologies with a few workarounds. So this is things like taking a very small drone that's a lot easier to fuel and transport, and using zip ties to get other cameras on there, and doing a lot of manual flights. So trying to keep the energy needs of the equipment down since we have a very limited amount of gas for our generator. the second thing that I do is I normally pilot these flights manually because there's a lot of issues being so close to magnetic north and trying to use automatic flights. So that's often a bit of an issue too. So there's been a lot of trial and error, especially when it comes to the thermal imaging in my research. So one of the biggest things that I've done that's made a great difference is using thermal imaging with the drones so that I'm not just mapping the landscape and looking at the relationships between these features, but so I can see what's actually under the ground by the heat signatures of things that are buried. So this has been really helpful because it means that we're not limited to test pitting and doing these different survey sampling techniques to figure out where these settlements were, but I can figure out beforehand with a few drone flights where these camps actually are. And so that allows us to get a lot more done during the field season.
Wow, that's cool. You know, when I think of the conventional archaeologist that goes out with a trowel, which it sounds like you're doing digs too, but you're doing drone flights. That's a totally different layer of data and observation that I wouldn't think of being associated with archaeology. And you mentioned thermal images, which sounds super exciting for me due to my climate change themes of my research. I wonder, how does climate change and climate affect the communities that you're working with? What are the important sides or considerations of climate in your work?
Sure. So I'll begin by saying that Arctic climate change is a very contentious, very politically fueled issue for most people in the world. The Arctic is a contested place, the borders of the Arctic. There's natural resources there, there's commercial interests, industrial interests, and then, of course, there's the local stakeholders that subsist off this land and that live traditional lifestyles. And
Right.
being able to conserve the environment and to manage it in a way that these animals keep thriving is so incredibly important, not just for all people, but in the communities that I work in, this is a primary source of food security. So if the seal disappear, there's simply not enough resources for a lot of families to get enough food. And in Arctic Canada, this is a major crisis. There's a food crisis, there's also a housing crisis. So there's a lot of different issues that are cultural, that are on the cusp of climate change. And in the context of these Indigenous communities, it becomes very complicated because conservation work and environmental science has often been used as a colonial tool.
Yeah.
Not always, but especially decades and decades ago, a lot of the work was premised on an understanding that in order to save these local communities, we need Western scientists to come in and manage resources for them. And by approaching research in that way, it also suggests that local people can't manage these resources themselves. So a lot of researchers in the last decade have gone through great efforts to create these collaborative projects and to right the wrongs of the past. But because of this scientific history that goes back 150 years, there are still a lot of issues when it comes to trust and collaboration. And there is a tendency for people to feel like they're not being heard. And this becomes very prevalent when we talk about things like polar bear populations, or if you think about the fur trade. So there's a very famous documentary called Angry Inuk, and it documents the relationships between animal rights activists and conservationists and the lifestyles of Inuit and other traditional peoples that subsist off the land that need to sell furs in order to pay for the fuel they need to go out in their boats to hunt the animals that they survive on and subsist on. So there's this very complicated web of what people need to survive and what all humans have an interest in. We're all stakeholders in climate change, and what happens to the Arctic will affect the rest of the world. But there's a history behind the science, and I think we're only now starting to begin to decolonize a little bit of that history and deconstruct it and understand how we should go about doing things differently in the future. it's on the cusp of my research because the people that I work with are not, I work with Inuit, but the people that I study are not in Inuit. They're people that disappeared about 1,000 years ago, but they exist within Inuit oral histories. And so for me, part of this has to do with the underlying logics as to how we understand modern subsistence and modern ties to places. So for me, I try to emphasize that people in the past didn't simply survive in landscapes. They thrived within landscapes. They had complex relationships with their environments, and they actually were, in fact, able to manage these environments quite well and survive for a very long time. And so there's a lot to learn from in terms of the respect we show for cultures and for the ability of these modern communities to manage their own lands.
Yeah, it's interesting hearing about the different narratives that a lot of Western scientists are exposed to versus those that are experienced and lived by the communities we work in. And I think of in ecology, there's different bodies of thought and philosophy about how we go about conserving the planet. For instance, there's a lot of emphasis upon protecting areas and keeping people out, having the pristine nature that is untouched by any type of community or human. And that serves a very important role. There are places on Earth that we hope to keep as wild as possible and untouched from human influence. But at the same time, like you were mentioning, there's places where people have been living for hundreds or thousands of years in a really sustainable manner. And I think of some examples in tropical ecology where there have been indigenous communities in Peru and Brazil and Papua New Guinea, where actually they've looked at some of the history of that landscape, and the biodiversity was higher in places where humans traditionally settled as opposed to other locations, because the humans were collecting fruit nuts and planting them in the vicinity that would then attract birds and insects and other types of pollinators and create this lush landscape. So it's kind of this, I guess, this dichotomy of perspectives of what is the most important way to conserve but also live with these natural landscapes. And it's something that I know I really grapple with working in protected areas that have very little human influence, but at the same time working in other locations where people have been living there for a long time.
That actually leads me to the next question I wanted to ask you, Dave. I wanted to know a little bit more about the more human side of your research. We talked a little bit about plans you had in terms of interviews and different community collaborations. Could you tell me more about that?
Right, yeah. So some of our work in the what we call working landscapes outside the national park, where there's forest patches as well as agricultural lands, we're constantly collaborating with the local communities because we desperately need them. I can't possibly navigate these landscapes without Gista and George, who know the area. So there's a lot of back and forth in terms of deciding where we're going to be surveying, what are the culturally significant areas that they want to be monitored for frog populations. For instance, there's also another layer to my research that I've gotten involved with the Madascar National Park System, where they have initiated a community member-led biodiversity monitoring project. So the national parks are spread out all across the country, but number of them are pretty remote and hard to get to. So it's tough for the national park staff to go out there and monitor the lemurs and the birds, the amphibians on a regular basis. However, there's communities, local peoples that live around these national parks who know the landscapes really well. And they may not be familiar with the scientific names of the species, but they have local names and clades. So this project led by Madascar National Parks has been going to work with these local communities to help link the local and scientific names, and then just give a little bit of a nudge in the direction of standardized surveys. Go out into these parks and walk the same transects twice a month. And the nice thing is that they get salary for being involved in this project. And we get this excellent time series of biodiversity data where they're going out and visiting the parks every month, multiple times. And so I'm able to turn all of that biodiversity data into more of a holistic image of what are the trends in time at these different national parks, and also compare the community member biodiversity data with some of the national park staff data and see what is the best allocation of hiring expert staff versus community members so that we can provide livelihoods for people and understand biodiversity in a holistic sense. So it's been a really exciting collaboration.
I love that. And I completely agree with you. There's definitely different kinds of expertise. And I like how you explained this idea of there's different names for these different species, and we can take these different ways of knowing and being with the world. And there are these conceptual spaces where we can harmonize them and have them come together to create better science that serves more different types of people. And so I really like that. In my research, place names also play a really big part. There's an interview component to my work. I mentioned before that the people I study called the Tuni. That's the Inuit name for the people I study. It means the little people. These people within the myths, they were actually shapeshifters, and they could grow really big and they can shrink really small, which is how they got their name. And it's really interesting when you compare those more sort of fluid, abstract understandings of history with the more empirical side of things that we study. And then you realize that there's actually these empirical scientific links and the way these things enhance each other. So for example, this idea of the Tuni being shapeshifters makes a lot of sense when you see that a lot of the stone tools that they were using were smaller than a thumbnail. Because chert was such a sparse resource that you had to use every little bit that you could. So they made these tiny little tools that they were able to hunt these massive animals with. And to retain heat, they lived in these very small huts. Some of them are only 2 meters in diameter. So there's a lot of really interesting myths about how the Tuni were caribou hunters, something that we've archaeologically verified. They didn't hunt a lot of caribou, but one of the reasons the Inuit say that they were very successful at caribou hunting was because to fit in their little houses, they had to sleep with their feet pointing up in the air. And so all the blood drained out of their feet, and so they could run really fast to catch the caribou. But when we learn from those different stories, we're actually able to find these archaeological correlates when we dig. So we have these very small tools. We have evidence of caribou blinds showing that the caribou were chased into certain paths, and they were strategically hunted by controlling their movement. So there's this hidden information in stories, but I was going to say also in place names. So the sites that I work at and the areas around them, they all have traditional names. A lot of these place names give us really important historic information, ecological information about the landscape itself. And so this is something that I'm incorporating in with my geospatial model so that I can create what's called a counter map or a deep map. So for example, one of the sites I work at is called Kapuavik. That's the traditional name for that peninsula. And the name means the place where we go to spear the fish. In previous archaeological research, this site is typically understood as a place where the Tuni went to hunt walrus. But if we understand that 1,000 years ago, this was a historic place where early Inuit speared fish, then it gives us something else to look for in the archaeological record. As you can imagine, fish bones don't preserve as well as walrus bones. So it's not necessarily something that's going to jump out at us and that we're going to find. But if we have expectations for what we want to investigate empirically, it changes what we're able to see in the different scales at which we're going to look at that information. So the thinness of the mesh that we're going to use to screen the dirt so that maybe perhaps we can find these fish bones, something that without the traditional story, we might not have thought of doing. Or another one of the sites is called Alanik, and the name means the place that faces away from the sun. And as you can imagine, when you're in the Arctic Circle, there actually is a period of time where land faces away from the sun. It's the opposite of the midnight sun. It's the dead of winter.
Right.
So we know that traditionally through Inuit stories and Inuit place naming, that early Inuit, this was predominantly a winter site. It would have been a place that was inhabited when the land faced away from the sun. So it gives us these different correlates. While I study a different culture, the landscape itself is continuous. It's something that bonds people existing today with people that existed 5,000 years ago. And so these different kinds of knowledge can be brought together, and they can provide a richer, more full and textured picture of what past landscapes might have looked like.
Yeah, it's interesting hearing about how your work both uses these quantitative geospatial tools to understand space, which ecologists, we do too, using satellite imagery or drones, or we go out into the field, and us ecologists, we love to put everything in boxes and just have grids that identify every space on the planet. But at the same time, you're also understanding what place is. And I think that that's something that a lot of environmental scientists have lessons to learn, and that spaces may be defined by the perspective that we're bringing to the table, but that place may mean something different to the local inhabitants, or a different worldview that is investigating the area. So I wonder, what would maybe be some lessons learned from the perspectives that you have adopted, or the frameworks you've used in your research, that maybe other scientists or other explorers can learn from when we go to visit these remote locations?
Absolutely. So one of the points I make in my research, and it's a point that many would contest, but Western space, our idea of space is something that can be measured. It really is just another kind of place, because it exists within a situated cultural understanding of what the world is, that the world is something that can be measured, that space is something that we can calculate in these different ways. That exists within a very particular worldview that not all people share. So I think one way to create these more harmonized research perspectives is to not hold Western science as something that is exceptional, or is something that's privileged over other ways of knowing. There's a lot of research in technosciences, specifically through feminist technosciences, that discusses that the relationship between fact and fiction, they're a lot more complicated than we might think, even when it comes to engineering or quantum physics. We hear a lot about the difference between the two-slot experiment, and how an electron can be a wave and can also be a particle, and it could be both of these things depending on where you're standing with the sensor when you do the measurement. It could physically change. So we actually do have this potential within Western science to understand that something can be more than one thing at the same time, and that the tools that we use to learn, the different apparatuses that we use, and the position in which we physically stand when we experience things and observe things, and the knowledge we have prior to that point in time, those come with subjectivities, right? There's no such thing as data that hasn't already been interpreted. So we should approach Western scientific research with the same perspective that we tend to approach more humanistic understandings of the world and other ways of being and knowing in the world, such as indigenous ontologies and views of the world. These things aren't so different. When I determine that something is an archaeological site, I've materialized a place. I've pulled something out of the landscape and I've made it something else. It's a form of placemaking. It exists because of my understanding of what an archaeological site is. It's not exceptional to Inuit ways of seeing the world. They're different and they're equal. And I think that we have a tendency to say that without finding ways to work into our research that's more practical. And so I think that's something that scientists need to work on moving forward, including myself. David, I also wanted to ask you, given that we're doing this on webcams right now, how has COVID affected your work? I think you mentioned that you went into the field, but things went a little differently, and that also had to do with these enriching community relationships that you've been building.
Yeah, things have been interesting during the pandemic, that's for sure. We were not able to spend as much time working with our Malagasy collaborators as we were hoping to, those of us based in the United States. But I was able to head out into the field and do some of our surveys of microclimate and frogs. But luckily, we were able to build upon that with the strength of our local collaborations. I handed off some of the protocols that I had been developing and continued to brainstorm with some of the graduate students in Madagascar that I work with. And they were able to continue some of our field surveys without my need to be there on the ground. So in some ways, it was a really immense challenge trying to figure things out during the pandemic, where we had this giant wrench thrown into the mix. But at the same time, it was pretty enlightening in that we were able to manage most of our work in the same fashion without necessarily having the American scientists there on the ground. And of course, there's tons of part of the research that doesn't just take place in the field. We had this really nice strength where some of my Malagasy collaborators were able to collect the data in the field and then send it off to me, where I could run some of the statistical analyses and models back here in the United States. So as a result, we were able to complement some of our strengths and explore a couple more research avenues. For instance, I was able to bring on a Malagasy master's student to help with our field work that he probably wouldn't have been able to have the opportunity otherwise, because I wouldn't have been looking for a larger field team. So it was both a drawback, but also kind of a nice opportunity. And I wonder the same thing with you. I mean, how have you managed during the pandemic, or what are ways that you've kind of attempted to navigate around this mess that we've been in for the past couple of years?
It's definitely changed my research and my plans in terms of the field component of my research has changed a lot because of it. So I haven't been physically in the field since 2019 because of the pandemic. It's just working in such a remote environment with these very small communities, because I do have to pass through them, and we usually work with local collaborators when we go up to do our field work. There just wasn't a safe way to go and visit these communities with the risk of COVID, especially because a lot of these communities don't have hospitals. They typically have a nurse and a small health center, but they don't have access to a hospital. They have to get flown down for medical care. So Canada had a lot of initiatives in terms of trying to prevent COVID from reaching these remote communities. And researchers on top of that were very cautious. Even as things are opening up, we're all still being quite cautious. There's a potential that I might go into the field early this September because I'm fully vaccinated now, and because the community is fully vaccinated, or at least most people in the community are. I'm just waiting to see how it plays out to make sure that vaccination is enough in the community and that there is no contact spread from the different communities as people begin to move around again. But most likely I'll be able to do a very short trip. But like I mentioned before, summer is very short and this will be the fall. So there might be some snowfall. That might be a different thing I have to work around in terms of being able to excavate, but hopefully I'll be able to at least do the drone surveys as long as the weather cooperates more or less. I would say that the thing that's been very difficult for me isn't so much the field work, because I do have tons of data because of the geospatial data I collected. A lot of archaeology, really, we think about field work and trowel and digging in the ground, but that's maybe 10% of what archaeologists do. You can see all these lovely bones behind me. There's a lot of stuff that we dig out of these sites, and then it all has to be cleaned, conserved, cataloged before it could be sent to the Museum of Natural History. So there's a lot that goes into our work outside of the field. I can't say that I've run out of work that I need to do that's related to my project. So I'm in a really good position when I do get to go into the field again. But the thing that I think has been the hardest is my charity. So usually in relation to the archaeological field work, we run a kids camp. This was something that was created, well, inspired because of my high school teacher that I mentioned. She actually ran these educational programs for much younger kids, and I used to volunteer with her. And she helped me create this program up north in Igloolik in the community that I work in. So it was really disappointing to finally get the charity off the ground and to run the camp, just to have to take this hiatus and not know when it'll be safe to do that again. So hopefully if I go up in September, kids will be in school, so I can't run a full day camp, but I might be able to do an after school version of the camp in September. So here's hoping.
Fingers crossed. Yeah, that sounds like an amazing initiative and a really nice way of giving back to the community. We've been trying to start an education program. It was actually the idea of the Malagasy master's student that I work with, where he's developing educational pamphlets for the village members so they can learn a little bit more of the scientific knowledge about the frog species there. And we're hoping to have a little bit more of exchange in that respect in order to give back from, as opposed to going out there and doing this parachute science of jumping in and collecting data and disappearing afterwards. And I wonder with your work, talking about your charity sounds like a really exciting product that comes from your work out there. For your research and the parts of your dissertation, the questions you're asking, what are some of the products that you're hoping to come from this? How do you think your research insights will be used?
The first one I think is more methodological, epistemological. So more in the sense of I'm sort of doing a proof of concept thing that we actually can use these different types of technologies in terms of the drone data and the satellite data and the geophysical stuff, so that we can enrich our data sets and make them more robust so we can understand more broader scale human-land relationships. So I would say that that's one research output that I'm really excited about that I think will benefit archaeology in polar tundra sort of environments, because there's all of these logistic issues that will be a big benefit. The second is that while Inuit collaboration is a very common thing when working in early Inuit or historic Inuit archaeology, it's not as common when working with Tunit, given that they were a different culture, a different biological people. I think that one research output that I'm really excited about is by demonstrating how Inuit aren't simply this ethnographic analogy that we can use and sort of just project on the past. We can't say that these different peoples, that all peoples that hunt and gather and subsist, that they all have these commonalities because they have certain overlaps in their economic practices. Instead, I'm going about an approach where I see Inuit and Tunit as being a part of a shared landscape history. And I'm hoping by showing how the things that Tunit did 5,000 years ago sort of set certain processes in play that continue to affect Inuit today, that I can demonstrate that this is a shared unified history and that I can shine a little bit more light on who the true stakeholders are when it comes to these particular landscapes. So as an example, in the interview component of my research, I come across a lot of knowledge holders, specifically elders, saying things like that a particular stone monument, a particular Inukshuk that is located near one of these sites, that it is in fact several thousand years old, and it was built by the first people that came here. It was built by the Tunit. And that's interesting because it's not something that I can easily date. I can radiocarbon date organic samples. It's very difficult to grab a date on a statue without destroying a really big part of that statue or monument. So having that data is really valuable. But the interesting thing is the social connections that Inuit have with this non-Inuit heritage, right? this idea that the people that I study prepared the landscape for the Inuit, and that there is this bond and this attachment and this historic connection. And I think that's really important too, because archaeologists often act like they're the dominant authority on this particular history, but this isn't a dead history. We're not studying a dead culture. We're studying sites of living memory that people continue to become with and communities continue to be shaped by. So I'd say in terms of how research in my field can be approached in the future, those are the two main areas I see my research making a difference. This more empirical methodological side of, we can look at things on these different scales, and archaeology can happen from the sky, even in the Arctic. And this more social component of that, even if there isn't a descendant community, it doesn't mean that there aren't these effective bonds with historic places that we can explore so that we can see what comes into the archaeological record differently when we observe it, if we think about it in a different way. How about you, Dave? What research outputs do you see being really relevant that are going to come out of your project for your field?
Well, after having this conversation, I'm thinking more about trying to understand place rather than space. And so many new research questions are coming to mind. But what I hope to be coming from our work is we're also using drone imagery to map out the landscape. And we measure where different forest patches and different agricultural landscapes are in hopes of pairing this with our microclimate data to, from a theoretical sense, understand how much these different land uses restrict the distributions of frog species. They may be found only inside the forest patches because it's nice and cool and moist there. But they may also, in the agricultural areas, find shady trees or streams where they can get that same microclimate that they need. And the agricultural landscapes may therefore provide just the amount of thermal suitability that the frogs need in the forest. So ultimately, we're trying to understand what is the conservation value of the forest versus the agricultural landscapes. And ultimately, we're hoping for that to inform the decisions being made of priorities of what parts of land ought to be protected and kept away from human influence, as opposed to other parts of the landscape that can have more of a sustainable agriculture practice. This also can be helpful for understanding which frog species are most vulnerable, both to deforestation and to climate change. So by measuring our thermal tolerance of different amphibian species, we may be able to understand these are the frog species that may be at most risk from global warming, as opposed to other ones that are much more tolerant of warming temperatures. So we're hoping for some of our research to be used for both expanding our ecological understanding of these natural landscapes and the more practical sense of what are our priorities, what's out there that we really need to protect.
I really love that. I have a personal question that's not so much research related, but I couldn't leave this talk without asking, what is your favorite frog? What is your favorite frog species and why?
Well, that's a tricky one. It's hard to limit it down. I think I would have to choose one of my favorite frogs in Madagascar, which is Mantella baroni. They're a beautiful species that are lit up with all these amazing colors. And the Mantellid genus is like the poison dart frogs of Central and South America, where they're poisonous. But luckily for humans, they're not toxic enough so that ecologists like me can get away with going and catching them in the field. So they're definitely one of my favorites. And as for you, what do you think is the part of fieldwork or your research that you're most looking forward to getting back into when you get a chance to go back?
It might sound generic, especially because it's not directly related to my research questions. I picked my research questions because I really am interested in these big picture things, but the most exciting part of archaeology is when you uncover a piece of art, some special artifact. That's just the most amazing part in terms of like the exhilarating rush of being in the field. for me, it's when I find shaman's objects, things that I know were very meaningful to people. And I absolutely love when I find something like a little ivory pendant and it's polished in one particular spot. And I just know that was from someone's thumb and like I can hold it. And I know that 3,000 years ago, somebody was holding this and they were rubbing their thumb on this little seal pendant that they probably kept on their person all the time. And then I think about how crazy it is that I'm able to hold that now. And, you know, I feel connected to other generations. I feel more connected to the world. And yeah, it just makes things seem really fantastical. So that's probably my favorite part in terms of specific moments. The next thing that I find most exciting is when my methods actually work and I actually do uncover a site that we didn't know about. That's pretty cool too, but a little bit less emotional.
Or it can be just as emotional, and I imagine can be totally new and exciting discovery in a lot of ways. Maybe as one more question to leave the audience with is, for both of our research programs and the systems we work with, what do you think is a takeaway for when we go out and explore and walk with nature? What is something that we should all be considering just a bit more, in your opinion?
I think we need to pay more attention, and I think this relates to both of our research, to the different scales, not just at which the things we're interested in our research happen, but the scales at which life actually takes place, right? The fact that there are things so much smaller than us and things so much grander than us, and that these aren't isolated things, just, you know, when with cultural systems, just like with biological, ecological systems, these different relations on these different scales, they're all connected. Everything's a part of this complex network. And I think as researchers, we sometimes get a little myopic, we get a little too focused in what we do, and we think more about end products. And when we do that, the irony is that we tend to limit what those products can be in a way that isn't the best for our research. And I think that we really need to throw ourselves into the field. We really do need to walk with nature, and we need to be aware of the environments we're in, the responsibility we have in the stories that we tell as researchers, to the work we do in these communities, to how we articulate the knowledge that we're creating through our experience of these places as we participate in them. So I think that we really do need to look around us more, smell the roses, and think about the different things that influence how we do our research, as well as how our research influences the world that we're so interested in. How about for you, Dave?
Yeah, to answer your question, it's funny because what also came to mind for me is paying more attention in a particular way of when we go out on a trail, what may be just a few steps for us is the whole home range of an insect that's been living there, a species that's been there for generations. And so every step that we take may be a completely different world for the small microbiomes and microhabitats that exist there. So having that mindset when I go out into nature has kept me a little bit more humble of how much of a visitor I am in some respects, but also when I'm considerate, how we can be kind of harmonized with our usage of these landscapes. And so it seems for both of us, it's thinking small, but also thinking big, thinking into the future, but also into the past. And the lesson I'm learning is that consideration of all these things is where we get to have a better grasp of what a place is.
Absolutely. If you think about any moment in our research, it really is at the same time both a record or product of the past, of things that have happened either a long time ago or that have just recently happened. But that same moment is always a catalyst of something that will become in the future. Every single little decision, every single relationship that happens in nature, it has an impact on how things will continue to unfold, whether that's socially and culturally, how we experience, express, and understand and imagine landscapes, or on a more biophysical side of things, how landforms will physically change, how, you know, and how the Anthropocene will unfold in terms of climate change and the different practices that we participate in, whether they will help or hinder these ecosystems in general. And I would agree.
Well, Sam, this has been such a pleasure talking with you. You've given me a lot to think about, both for my research and for my further explorations. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing what you do next.
Thank you, Dave. You as well. This has been a really interesting conversation. It's really unique to hear so much about research in the tropics. It's very different from what I do. And I think I've learned of a few new things that will help me think differently about environments in general. So thank you for that.